Ever wonder how two faiths with so much in common could end up, well, not exactly seeing eye to eye?
It's a story that goes back centuries.
Today we're taking a deep dive into James Carroll's Constantine sword to explore the tangled history of Catholicism and Judaism.
It's a fascinating but often challenging journey.
Definitely. And for those of you who are always on the go, remember mindful moments.
Bite-sized knowledge, right?
Exactly. Perfect for those mental snacks throughout the day. Narrated by AI, too. But let's get back to our deep dive. Get ready for a stolen robe, a haunting cry from Auschwitz, and even a pope who might owe his sainthood to Bob Dylan.
It's a history full of surprises.
We're not just talking dates and names here. We're looking at how ideas, beliefs, and even misunderstandings have shaped the world we live in.
It's about understanding the roots of those ideas.
Absolutely. So let's start with Emperor Constantine, a man who wanted to unify Christianity, but might have accidentally sown the seeds of division.
He saw religious differences as a threat to his power,
So he needed to define Orthodox Christianity.
which meant deciding who was in and inevitably who was out.
A paradox, right? Trying to create unity by drawing lines.
Exactly. And that need for a rigid definition of Christianity had a huge impact on the relationship between these two faiths.
And then there's the story of the true cross, discovered by Constantine's mother, Helena. Suddenly, this symbol of Roman brutality becomes an object of veneration.
That's a massive shift, from an instrument of execution to proof of divine power.
And it really widened the gap between Christians and their Jewish roots. Like it was saying, look, we're right, you're wrong.
Exactly. And this symbol, meant to represent love and sacrifice, takes on a whole new meaning during the Crusades.
Becomes a rallying cry for violence.
A tragic turning point. Jewish communities, caught in the middle, find their identity forged in resistance and martyrdom.
Carroll doesn't hold back on the horrors of this period. It's clear these events left scars that run deep. But even amidst all that darkness, there were moments of light.
The convivencia in medieval Spain comes to mind.
Right, a time of relative tolerance, even collaboration.
Yeah.
Proof that peaceful coexistence was possible.
Shows the potential for something different.
And during this time, we see the rise of Kabbalah, a mystical Jewish tradition that even influenced Christian thinkers. Shows how ideas can transcend religious boundaries.
That's what's so fascinating about Kabbalah. This exploration of esoteric knowledge offers a completely different way of looking at the divine and our place in it.
So we have this mix of cultural exchange and intellectual curiosity happening alongside periods of intense conflict and persecution. Makes you wonder, were these moments of convivencia just exceptions, or could they have been a blueprint for a better relationship?
It's a question worth pondering. Speaks to the complexity of human nature, our capacity for both division and unity.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But to really understand how these forces played out, we need to look deeper into the theological debates that shaped Christian attitudes towards Judaism.
Those debates are key to understanding the evolution of this relationship.
And that's exactly where we're headed next. We'll be exploring thinkers like Anselm and Abelard and how their different interpretations of Jesus' death had a ripple effect on the relationship between these two faiths.
Their contrasting views are fascinating, really highlights the internal diversity within Christianity itself.
It's going to be a thought-provoking journey.
Absolutely. Stay with us. Back to our deep dive into Constantine's sword. We left off talking about the theological thinkers who shaped Christian perceptions of Judaism. Anselm's Curdio Homo, for example, really solidified the idea of Jewish culpability in Jesus' death.
It's amazing how an idea, born in a monk's quiet contemplation, could end up having such a huge impact on both religious doctrine and social attitudes.
Anselm's work provided a framework that placed the blame for Jesus' death squarely on the Jewish people. It's a view that unfortunately persisted for centuries.
But even within Christianity, there were dissenting voices, right? Like Abelard, who had a different take on things.
Abelard emphasized Jesus' humanity and downplayed the deicide Jew trope. It was a much more nuanced perspective, one that could have led to a less antagonistic relationship.
It seems like he was trying to shift the focus from blame to understanding. Why do you think his views weren't more widely accepted at the time?
Well, it was a pretty radical departure from the prevailing narrative. Maybe it was just too much of a change for people to embrace. But his perspective shows us that even within Christianity, there were different ways of interpreting this complex relationship.
It adds another layer to this story. And then, of course, we have the Spanish Inquisition, a period that marks a chilling shift from religious to racial antisemitism. This sets a dangerous precedent that echoes all the way into the 20th century.
That's when the concept of blood purity starts to take hold. an idea rooted not in theological differences, but in a notion of inherent racial difference. It's a toxic idea that would have devastating consequences.
And the persecution of conversos, Jews who converted to Christianity, often under duress, really illustrates that tragic shift.
They were never truly accepted, always under suspicion. A stark example of the insidious nature of racial prejudice.
It's heartbreaking. And as if the Inquisition wasn't enough, we see the establishment of the Roman ghetto, a physical manifestation of the Church's increasingly negative attitude toward Judaism. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like being confined to a specific area, separated from the rest of society.
The Roman ghetto, created in the 16th century, was a very real symbol of the Church's institutionalized discrimination against Jews. Sadly, it foreshadowed the restrictions and persecution that would become all too common in the centuries to come.
It's a bleak chapter in history. And as we move into the Enlightenment, a period often associated with reason and progress, we encounter figures like Voltaire, who championed those ideals, yet still held deeply problematic views towards Jews.
Voltaire embodies that contradiction. A brilliant mind, a proponent of individual liberty, yet he couldn't shake free of those anti-Semitic stereotypes. It reminds us that progress isn't always linear. Even those who advocate for reason can be blind to their own prejudices.
It's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder how we reconcile those contradictions. How do we explain the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason alongside the persistence of these harmful stereotypes?
I think it's important to remember that the Enlightenment was a product of its time. It carried within it the baggage of centuries of religious and social prejudice. We can't ignore that context.
It's a reminder that history is complex and messy. It's never just black and white.
Right. And then we come to the thorny issue of Pope Pius X and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
His papacy raises so many difficult questions about the Church's response to this horrific event.
The accusations of silence and complicity are hard to ignore. They cast a long shadow over his legacy. Carroll grapples with these issues in the book. He doesn't shy away from the complexities.
He presents a nuanced view of Pius XII, acknowledging both the criticisms and attempts to defend his actions. It's up to each reader to wrestle with those questions.
It's a lot to process, especially given the magnitude of the tragedy. And speaking of confronting difficult truths, the story of Edith Stein, the Jewish philosopher who converted to Catholicism, really struck me.
Her story is incredibly powerful. She embraces Christianity but never renounces her Jewish heritage. Ultimately, her conversion doesn't protect her from the horrors of the Holocaust.
It's a reminder that even in the face of such immense hatred, individual stories of faith and resilience shine through.
Exactly. She embodies the complexity of that era. Jewish and Catholic, philosopher and nun, a victim of persecution, but also a testament to the enduring power of faith.
It makes you think about identity and belonging, and the human capacity for both incredible cruelty and extraordinary love. It's a reminder that history is full of contradictions.
Speaking of contradictions, there's also the story of the convivencia we talked about earlier, this period of tolerance and intellectual exchange, and then the emergence of Kabbalah. It's an example of how ideas can transcend religious boundaries, creating these unexpected connections.
It's almost like a counterpoint to the dominant narrative of conflict. It makes you wonder, could these moments of convivencia have offered a different path?
It's a question that lingers. What if those periods of cooperation and understanding had been the rule rather than the exception?
A tantalizing thought. But to really understand where we are today, we have to look at the turning points, the moments that shape the course of history. And for Catholicism, one of those moments is Vatican II.
Absolutely. Vatican II and its groundbreaking document, Nostra Aetate, marked a significant shift in the Church's relationship with Judaism. It's a turning point in the story.
A monumental step toward reconciliation, renouncing the charge of collective Jewish guilt for Jesus' death, calling for dialogue, understanding, and respect.
It acknowledges that deep spiritual connection between Christians and Jews and paves the way for a new era.
It's hopeful, but as Carroll reminds us, the journey toward true reconciliation is far from over. There's still a lot of work to be done.
We can't just assume everything is fixed. Challenging anti-Semitic rhetoric, promoting education and understanding, building bridges of compassion, those efforts need to continue.
It's a call to action for all of us, regardless of our faith background. But before we wrap up, let's talk about forgiveness. Is it possible to truly forgive the Church for its role in this history of anti-Semitism?
That's a deeply personal question, and I don't think there's one right answer. But maybe true forgiveness isn't about forgetting or condoning the actions that caused harm.
Maybe it's more about acknowledging the depth of pain and choosing to move forward with compassion.
It's about breaking free from that cycle of resentment and retribution, using the memory of past wrongs to fuel positive change. It's a challenging idea, but a powerful one.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into James Carroll's Constantine's Sword. And in the last part, we left off with this big question: can we truly forgive the church for its past role in anti-Semitism?
It's something a lot of people struggle with. It's not an easy answer, is it? Forgiveness, especially on this scale.
Carroll seems to suggest that it's not about forgetting or condoning, the things that caused harm, but acknowledging that pain and still choosing to move forward.
It's like breaking free from that cycle of resentment, turning those memories, those wrongs, into something that drives change.
That's a powerful idea. But how do we actually do that? As individuals, as a society, how do we heal from something like this and make sure it doesn't happen again?
I think education is a big part of it. We need to make sure future generations understand the horrors of anti-Semitism, the importance of tolerance, respecting everyone.
It's about teaching people to think critically, to question stereotypes, to challenge prejudice when they see it.
And we can't forget about dialogue, creating spaces for people of different faiths to come together to share their perspectives, to build understanding.
To see each other as human beings, not us versus them. And we have to hold our leaders accountable, right? Making sure they don't just condemn anti-Semitism, but actually create policies that protect Jewish communities.
Creating a society where everyone feels safe and respected, no matter their background, no matter their faith. Carroll's book really reminds us that the past doesn't just disappear.
It's still with us. It shapes our present, influences our future.
Exactly. But we have a choice. We can choose to break free from the cycle of hatred. We can build a better world.
And that choice? It's up to each of us.
It really is. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Constantine's Sword. Of course, this is just the beginning.
There's so much more to explore. You can find a link to purchase the book in the show notes. And if this conversation resonated with you, please share it. Pass it along to someone who you think might find it meaningful.
Absolutely. And if you want to hear more deep dives like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We're always exploring new ideas, making connections, all to spark conversation and help you learn something new.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you've learned something and that it's inspired you to think about history, about understanding and the role we all play in creating a more just and compassionate world.